Ethics Untangled is made by the Idea Centre at the University of Leeds. It's a podcast about the difficult ethical questions we face in everyday life. In each episode, I interview someone, usually a philosopher, who's spent time thinking through one of these questions, and we try between us to work out what's going on. First of all, just to say that this episode has a content warning. It contains frank descriptions of sexual practices of various kinds, so definitely not one to listen to with younger kids. But also, it contains some discussion of sexual assault and rape, including rape by deception. Teledildonics is a word that refers to the use of networked electronic sex toys to facilitate sexual or quasi-sexual interactions between people at a distance. It's a relatively new type of technology, but one that's becoming more advanced. Clearly, it's a technology that opens up significant new possibilities, many of them potentially beneficial. But Robbie Arrell, lecturer in applied ethics at the Idea Centre, thinks it also raises some serious concerns, not all of which have yet been fully understood. In this conversation, Robbie outlines some of these worries and begins to consider how we might address them. So welcome to the podcast, Robbie.
Thanks, Jim. Happy to be here.
So, what are teledildonics?
Well, the term teledildonics refers to a relatively new breed of sex toys that can be remotely connected via the internet to other sex toys, which are capable through kind of haptic responsivity technology of bidirectional control, making it the case that they can sort of effectively speak to each other. And typically, most users apparently use them alongside webcams and virtual or augmented reality technologies to create an entirely more immersive sexual experience.
Okay, so this is something that's available at the moment, right? So how advanced is the technology currently?
It's reasonably advanced at the moment. So if you think, for example, of Lovense's flagship teledildonic devices, Max 2 and Nora. So Max 2 is a cylindrical penile sheath with a skin-like inside texture designed to mimic vaginal anatomy that vibrates and contracts. And Nora is a silicone phallus-shaped rabbit vibrator. So once each user connects their Bluetooth-enabled toy to their phones using the Lovense app, the haptic devices respond interactively via the internet to each other's relative movements and pace. So the manipulator in a particular point on one device will cause the corresponding point on the other device to react in near real time. And it's perhaps worth noting too that as well as being Nora to Max 2 compatible, the devices may also be diversely matched, supporting Max 2 to Max 2 and Nora to Nora connectivity. As for how advanced the technology is, I guess the fidelity between the output touch or sensation one user feels and the input on the other user's end is probably less than perfect currently. But the fidelity between input on one end and output on the other is improving with each new iteration of these devices as the sort of haptic responsivity technology itself evolves and becomes more sophisticated.
Okay, sounds fun. So what do teledildonics make possible that wasn't previously possible then?
Well, teledildonics potentially herald what I think you might describe as the coming of an evolved cybersex, very different from anything we've seen so far. So if you think about it, what traditionally passed for cybersex tended to be either self-stimulating solo masturbation, so involving one person, for example, to online images or videos, or synchronous self-stimulating mutual masturbation between two or more persons, via webcam sex, Skype sex, phone sex, virtual avatar to avatar, cyber sex, etc. But whatever the medium, you are always essentially masturbating yourself. Teledildonics, however, promise something more. Spatially separated other stimulating masturbation, or perhaps even spatially separated sexual intercourse, which is, if possible, sort of revolutionary. For although it's long been possible to watch and to listen to others masturbating themselves from afar, never before have we been able to touch each other from afar or masturbate each other from afar, potentially even have sexual intercourse with each other from afar. As such, the potential for teledildonics to disrupt long-standing views of what counts as sex and nearby related concepts is, I think, potentially seismic.
Okay, so we're going to talk about some reasons that we might have to worry about this technology, but it's worth saying, first of all, that you do think there are some positive implications that this technology can have, right?
Yeah, that's correct. As Lovins themselves claim on their website, their Nora and Max 2 teledildonics devices are, quote, the perfect sex toys for those in long-distance relationships. And indeed, many people in today's world are forced to spend significant periods of time away from their partners for work, or perhaps because of visa issues or immigration issues. So if teledildonics can facilitate the maintenance of sexual intimacy between long-distance lovers, perhaps making it possible for them to feel, touch, caress, penetrate, and be penetrated by each other across space like never before, I kind of expect that many will find themselves quite welcome to that, quite open to that possibility if they're in those kinds of circumstances where they're separated from each other. And also, I guess in some ways you might just think that teledildonics-enabled sex is, in a sense, a better option for safe sex, right? Given, you can't get pregnant from teledildonics-enabled sexual encounters, right? Or, there's no possibility of transmission of STIs. And plus, it's ordinarily easier to remove oneself from a teledildonics-enabled sexual encounter should you become, uncomfortable at any point. So for some people, I imagine teledildonics may be appealing insofar as they perhaps admit of a safer means of sexual exploration and experimentation.
Okay, great. So is there anything we should be worried about?
Well, yes, I think so. And that's because I believe that, not discounting their positive potential, teledildonics also appear to pose what I think are disturbing and novel risks of sexual assault. Okay,
so I suppose the first question I have then is, should we really think of it as being sexual assault when people are spatially separated from each other? Is it possible to sexually assault someone when you're separated from them like that?
Yes, I think it's actually uncontroversially possible. If you think about it, like if someone points a gun at you from across the room and threatens to kill you if you don't, penetrate yourself with some object of their sick choosing, I think we would want to say that you've been sexually assaulted in that case. Right? And assuming we can agree that what you suffer at the hands of your assailant in such a case genuinely is sexual assault, even though, you're on the other side of the room from them and they never touch you, there's no entanglement of flesh at any point, then that would seem to suffice to establish, I think, that sexual assault is indeed possible, even if the perpetrator and the victim are spatially separated from one another.
Yeah.
Moreover, I guess the thought that you're here a victim of sexual assault wouldn't require revision, I suspect, if the object you're forced to penetrate yourself with is a Lovins Nora, which your assailant has prepared with his Max 2 teledildonics device, so that when he slides it up and down his penis, you will have been experiencing the relative movements of his penis through the toy on your end. And if that seems right, then you will have been sexually assaulted by an assailant spatially separated from you via the medium of teledildonics, right? Which is to say, spatially separated sexual assault by teledildonics is possible.
Okay, just to clarify, we're talking in ethical terms here. I just thought it's worth kind of mentioning there might be a separate question about whether somebody could be sexually assaulted in legal terms, right? So there'd be a legal definition of sexual assault, and whether or not what we're talking about here can conform to that would be a separate question from what we're talking about here. We're saying kind of whether it would be legally defined as sexual assault or not, it would still be kind of morally equivalent to sexual assault, something like that.
Yeah, I think that's correct. So I think it is, I'm focused here on making a moral argument for the case that this could qualify as a sexual assault. Whether it legally qualifies is going to somewhat depend on jurisdiction. Like there's lots of variability across jurisdictions. Well, we'll see. We'll say a bit more about that when we come to the rape by deception stuff, I think.
Okay, great. All right. So that what you've said there seems really plausible. But I'd have to say it's not the kind of case I'd imagine when talking about or thinking about sexual assault by teledildonics. So I think most people, like me, I'm guessing, are imagining that the assailant is in a separate location altogether online, right? So it's not somebody across the room. It's somebody in a different neighborhood, a city, or even a different country. So if that's right, that seems like a more challenging thought, right? The idea that you could be sexually assaulted by someone who's hundreds or perhaps thousands of miles away from you and not just a few feet across the room. So isn't that kind of case relevantly different from the case where you're on the other side of the room?
Well, I think the across the world type case is likely to be different to the across the room case insofar as the psychological terror you're going to experience if your assailant is right there in the room with you is likely to be much greater, for sure. But I think it's hard to see why co-presence or distance per se should be morally relevant, right, or make a moral difference as regards whether something qualifies as a sexual assault. What makes it sexual assault, after all, I assume, is the fact that your assailant forced you to engage in a sexual activity without your consent. And if that is actually what's happened, it's not clear why the assailants being physically near, across the room or physically far across the world should really cause us to need to revise our moral assessment as to whether you were sexually assaulted or not.
Okay, but I suppose one difference that a skeptic about spatially separated teledildonics sexual assault might push back on here, though, is that you would be at less immediate risk of being harmed, right? So if somebody's threatening you, you'd be at less immediate risk of being shot or killed or hurt or whatever as a result of non-compliance in the case where you're on the other side of the world. So doesn't that make a difference?
I don't really think it does. For one thing, I think it's actually pretty easy to think of cases in which the risk of being harmed would be just as high in the across the world case, right? So, for example, if your assailant has hired or even just purports to have hired a hitman who's tracking your every move and has been instructed to kill you if you don't comply, or maybe more plausibly, if they claim to have, I don't know, like maybe sexually explicit images or footage of you that they're going to send to everyone in your contacts, potentially ruin your life, that seems like still very serious harm, right? And in any case, I'm inclined to think that even if we were to concede that the risk of immediate harm is much higher in the across the room case, I'm inclined to ask what actually would follow from that, right? So suppose, for example, that you were the victim in the across the world case and, scared out of your wits, you complied with your assailant's sick directives to penetrate yourself while they watched on via webcam. And suppose then that you go to report this incident to the police. What should they say to you? Should they say, that's, unfortunate, but what happened to you doesn't qualify as sexual assault, I'm afraid, because, you could have just disconnected your internet and immediately called us instead of consenting to the assailant's demands, right? You had options, don't you see, to resist being sexually assaulted, but you chose not to resist, chose not to fight back. And because you chose not to, that means you can't claim to have been sexually assaulted. Right? Well, no, that's blatantly ridiculous, right? I mean, baking resistance conditions into the definition of what it takes to qualify as a victim of sexual assault is viewed extremely dimly nowadays, and I think rightly so. And moreover, one particular reason why you might think a resistance condition of this kind is really problematic is because it would require, minimally, the victims of sexual assault, in fact, realize they're being sexually assaulted at the time they're being sexually assaulted. Because, it's too late to resist after you've been sexually assaulted, right? But not all victims of sexual assault do. In particular, what I'm thinking of here are victims of sexual assault by deception.
Okay, so what's sexual assault by deception then? And is it obvious what constitutes sexual assault by deception? So what are the cases that you have in mind here?
So cases of sexual assault by deception refer to cases in which lying to someone in order to con them into having sex with you arguably constitutes sexual assault or perhaps even rape on account of the deception vitiating their consent, such that they would not have consented to have sex with you but for the deception element. Now, you can probably imagine cases where it wouldn't be at all obvious that we would want to say sex obtained by means of deception constitutes, I don't know, sexual assault or rape. So suppose, for example, your Tinder date shows up wearing Crocs and you pretend to love the aesthetic of rubber clogs made of holes in the hopes of boosting your chances of a sexual foray that night. And let's suppose your pretense is successful. Now, arguably, no crime occurs here. It's true that you lied to get your date to agree to sex with you. Let's assume, as we have, that the date ends with sex and wouldn't have had you been honest about the depths of your loathing for Crocs, because, your date is like a Crocs fanatic or something like that. But would we want to say that you sexually assaulted or raped your date? I think most people are going to have intuitions here that suggest that's too far, right? Yeah. That's not the case. But I think we really need to, take this possibility of sexual assault, rape by deception very seriously, right? And certainly we shouldn't be too swift to dismiss the possibility of sexual assault by deception, on the basis of sort of glib observations like these. And even in the literature, there are other somewhat more contentious cases around sexual assault or rape by deception. And in each case, you can kind of think about it as, what a complainant might say. So, for example, they might say, I would not have consented to sex with them, but for they told me they were single, when in fact they weren't. Or but for they told me they would use a condom, when in fact they surreptitiously removed it sometime before or during sex. So stealthing, as it's called. Or perhaps I would not have consented to sex with them, but for they told me they were on the pill and so we needn't use a condom, when in fact they weren't. Or but for they told me they wouldn't ejaculate in me, when in fact they did. Or perhaps I would not have consented to sex with them, but for they told me they were infertile and so we needn't use a condom, when in fact they weren't. Or but for they told me they were STI free, when in fact they weren't. Or perhaps we can imagine someone saying, I would not have consented to sex with them, but for they led me to believe they were male, when in fact they weren't. And this might seem a little bit odd, but I don't know if you've heard of the case of Gail Newland. It was basically a case in which Newland catfished her female victim into believing she was a man called Kai, with whom the victim embarked on a mainly online relationship. Occasionally, though, as well as, interacting online, they would arrange to meet at a hotel on the proviso that the victim would arrive first and blindfold herself and never touch Kai when Kai arrived, because Newland had told the victim that he had body dysmorphic disorder and as such couldn't bear anyone touching their body. Newland then would arrive and have sex with the victim, penetrating her with a strap-on prosthetic penis. That's maybe a little bit more bizarre than some of the other cases, but all of them, I think, fall into the category of a certain type of sexual assault or rape by deception, whereby the deception is via misrepresentation, right? So the deceiver has misrepresented some material fact about themselves or their intentions, but is nevertheless one and the same persons as the person the victim believes themselves to be having sex with. Right. However, there is also another category of sexual assault by deception, which involves deception not by misrepresentation, but deception by impersonation, whereby one might say, I would not have consented to sex with them, but for I believed it was not them I was having sex with, but someone else. And so an example of this type of sexual assault by deception is the case of Abigail Finney, right, who was a student back in, I think it was 2017 at Indiana Purdue University. And one night after falling asleep with her boyfriend in his dorm room at the university during a party, Finney woke up a bit later to what she assumed was him spooning and cuddling her in the dark room, which then turned into sex. When the sex was over, however, she went to the bathroom, and when she returned, was distraught to see not her boyfriend, who, as it happens, at some point had got up and returned to the party unbeknownst to Finney, but instead a completely different man who had been at the party, a man called Donald Grant Ward, lying in the bed smiling up at her. Now, I grant that people will tend to have different intuitions about some of these candidate cases of sexual assault by deception, right? Which in a way is pretty interesting in itself, really, because if you think that deception vitiates or invalidates consent, and if you think non-consensual sex is sexual assault or rape, then all of these cases are sexual assault or perhaps even rape. But whatever the case, I'm inclined to think that the final sort of case, at least, is a pretty clear-cut case. Indeed, in the UK, at least, deception of this sort, right, the impersonation deception, where the victim is tricked into having sex with someone who is not actually the person with whom they believe themselves to be having sex, is explicitly codified as sexual assault under Section 76 of the Sexual Offences Act 2003. Therein, it's stipulated that consent is invalidated in circumstances in which the defendant intentionally induces the complainant to consent to the relevant act by impersonating a person known personally to the complainant. As such, I expect that had Donald Grant Ward done what he did to Abigail Finney in the UK, he'd now be behind bars. As it is, though, he was acquitted of rape in an Indiana court, even after admitting to tricking Finney. But anyway, like we spoke about before, we're concerned here more with the moral questions rather than the legal questions. And it seems to me that at least morally, even if not always legally, depending on location, what Ward did to Finney did in fact constitute rape by deception, as opposed to being merely ungentlemanly conduct, as Ward's defense attorney argued, and with which the jury agreed in that case. So anyway, I feel like I've gone off on a bit of a rant there, but all of that's kind of just to say that I think rape and sexual assault by deception is a very real phenomenon, and it's a real issue, and something that I think we need to pay much more attention to and take much more seriously than maybe my silly Crocs example might suggest.
Right. So in what ways might teledildonics increase the risk of rape by deception?
Well, it's arguable, and indeed has already been argued by some former colleagues of mine, Rob Sparrow and Lauren Karras from Monash University, that teledildonics may essentially sort of turbocharge risks of rape by deception. Teledildonics, after all, enable you to get up close and personal without needing to be physically up close and personal. And as such, you think this is plausibly going to make it easier than ever before, perhaps, to con others into sex via deceit when you're on the other ends of online connections. Right? So in setting out their argument, Sparrow and Karras draw on a number of imaginative hypothetical scenarios, all designed to test and clarify our intuitions regarding the possibility of teledildonics-enabled rape by deception. Many of those scenarios present cases of deception by misrepresentation, but they also have a number of cases that involve the other kind, right? The Finney style deception, deception by impersonation. Right. So for example, like one case which is called hacked spouse, in which a hacker hacks the connection between a couple's teledildonics, so that the woman's teledildo is connected to and being controlled by the hacker's teledildo instead of her husband's.
Yeah.
Another one is crossed wires. In this case, a hacker essentially crosses the wires between 4 teledildonics devices, so that both partners in each of 2 sexual encounters have sex with someone other than the person with whom they believe they're having sex. And another kind of case of deception by impersonation that they talk about is what they call unintended intercourse, in which a woman is using a teledildo for the purpose of self-stimulating solo masturbation. Now, she believes that the sensations provided by the teledildo are the result of it running a recorded program of sex with a famous porn star, which is one of the things that's possible with these devices. Right? But in actual fact, a hacker has surreptitiously linked their teledildo to the woman's teledildo, such that the hacker and the woman are engaged in cybersex without the woman's knowledge. Right. So, look, there's lots of stuff we could say and discuss about those examples, right? But what I kind of want to point to here, and what I think is striking, is that all of them, right? So all of Sparrow and Karras' deception by impersonation examples involve hackers in some capacity. Right? And of course, you might think, well, it's perfectly proper that they should speak at length about hackers. After all, I think as potential culprits, they're probably foremost in most people's minds in cases like this. Cases where the person that the victim is conned into having teledildonics enabled sex with is not the same person the victim believes themselves to be having sex with. Those kinds of cases, right? But is it only hackers that we need to be worried about in these kinds of deception by impersonation cases? I'm inclined to think not, and I think that perhaps Sparrow and Karras have missed something here, right? So consider a different type of scenario, which I'll call multiple perpetrators. In this kind of scenario, you have a woman, and the woman believes she is having sex with her boyfriend, who is currently overseas, using a teledildo and a webcam. However, unbeknownst to her, her boyfriend has maliciously given his connected penile sheath, and thus control of her teledildo with which she is penetrating herself, to his co-conspirator friend, as well as, maybe sharing his screen with him so he can see her. As such, the movements she feels inside her vagina, which she believes to be the relative movements of her boyfriend's penis, are actually the movements of his friend's penis penetrating the corresponding penile sheath. And we can assume that the woman would not have consented to have sex with her boyfriend's co-conspirator friend. Right? Now, for my part, I suspect that, given the kind of world we live in, right, that's one in which revenge porn and catfishing are things that people do to each other. I think this might well be where the main threat of teledildonics-enabled sexual assault and rape by deception will come from. So not from hackers primarily, but rather more prosaically, I think, from victims' own sexual partners and their co-conspirator friends born of cruelty, perhaps compounded by a lack of understanding of the seriousness of their actions. Which is just to say, I think there's a much more disturbing prospect made possible by teledildonics than those raised by Sparrow and Karras' hacker-based cases. The prospect, that is, of multiple perpetrator sexual assault by deception.
Okay, so what's that? What's multiple perpetrator sexual assault by deception?
Okay. Perhaps the easiest way to grasp what multiple perpetrator sexual assault by deception might entail is to envisage a single perpetrator rape by deception. So maybe like the Finney case we just described earlier, right? Only with the minor adjustment that the person impersonated so in this case, Finney's boyfriend, is actually the one who orchestrates the sexual assault. And I should stress here that there's absolutely no suggestion that Finney's boyfriend had anything to do with this or orchestrated it or collaborated with Donald Grant Ward at all. I'm just using it as an example.
Sure. Okay. So, well, it strikes me that you've had to work that example up, right? So, does that mean that there aren't any real life examples of this kind of thing?
No. So not that I can find, right? And I've done a lot of research and may need to burn my hard drive at some point. No, I've really struggled to uncover any reported cases of multiple perpetrator rape by deception, right? And just to be clear here, so that we're not, there's no mistakes, what I'm saying. I'm not saying I've struggled to find evidence of real-life instances of teledildonics-enabled multiple perpetrator sexual assault by deception. What I mean is that I've struggled to find real-life cases of multiple perpetrator rape by deception of any kind whatsoever, right? Sadly, by contrast, my research turned up no shortage of reported cases of multiple perpetrator rape, right? So the kinds of cases where boyfriends have sort of let their friends gang rape their girlfriends, depressingly. But putting those findings together, right, that multiple perpetrator rape and sexual assault are more common than perhaps we want to think they are, and on the other hand, that none of these kinds of sexual assault or rape by deception appear to have been reported.
Yeah.
Putting these findings together, I can't help but wonder whether the fact that multiple perpetrator rape by deception has apparently not occurred on any kind of large scale before now may, depressingly perhaps, be more a function of the sheer logistical difficulty involved in coordinating and executing the deception element when multiple perpetrators are involved, more so than perhaps a function of human decency. If so, the worry is that perhaps teledildonics may be about to change all that.
So one thing that strikes me about these kinds of cases that you're describing there is that in many of those cases, the victim might not actually know that a rape or a sexual assault has taken place, and therefore doesn't experience what's happened as rape or sexual assault. So is that relevant to the question of whether that instance actually counts as rape or sexual assault?
Right. I'm inclined to say it's not morally relevant. At least, personally, I don't think we should say that if the deceived girlfriend, say in the hypothetical multiple perpetrators case I just described, doesn't experience the sexual assault, that then it can't be sexual assault. Right? At least if that were so, we would have to say that Abigail Finney wasn't sexually assaulted by Donald Grant Ward, the imposter who snuck into her bed pretending to be her boyfriend. Right? But that seems problematic to me, right? And more generally, we'd have to say that people who, don't remember being sexually assaulted, perhaps because drugged, aren't sexually assaulted. And not only is this hard to accept, but it would also have the strange implication that in some ways, the more devious, clever, and careful the deceiver, the more likely they are to be innocent of sexual wrongdoing. For example, a perpetrator who takes care only ever to sexually assault extremely well-groomed children, or people with severe mental disabilities, or perhaps very deep sleepers or slightly drugged victims, etc. And then I suppose you might just say as well, as with Finney, and no doubt most victims of this kind of assault, even if the initial assault is not experienced as harmful as such, the psychological trauma suffered if or when they do learn the truth of what was done to them, I think is going to be likely significant and severe too.
Yeah. sure. Okay. So how should we deal with these problems then? It sounds like you've identified, a real danger there. So are there ways of reducing the risk? So, I suppose some ways you might try and reduce the risk would be through changes to the technology, or maybe changes to the law, or maybe you'd want, people's individual practices to change. So are there other ways of reducing that risk?
I think so. On the technical fixes, I'm not really qualified, but, are there fixes that might go some way towards minimizing the prospect of this kind of teledildonics-enabled sexual assault by deception? Perhaps. Although, to be frank, I kind of struggle to imagine a technical solution for the multiple perpetrators case. But like I said, that's well outside of my kind of sphere of technical expertise. So, maybe that's not so surprising that I can't imagine the solution there. Legislation, sure. Regulatory measures, sure. Could they be part of the answer? I think so. Certainly, as regards regulating the design, and privacy concerns, which I haven't much focused on here, but are, well documented.
Yeah.
As well as security concerns, right? Particularly, regulating the ever-developing haptic responsivity technologies and teledildonics coming down the track. But really, I think it's going to be with education. That's where it's at, right? For my own part, I think it's entirely possible that despite the dearth of reported cases, or at least that I could find, I think it's entirely possible that some persons have perhaps already been subject to sex toy-enabled sexual assault by deception. That, let's assume they've learned that that's what happened to them, but maybe never reported it because, I don't know, for any number of reasons, really. Perhaps they were unsure that the acts they were engaging in actually counts as sex, or maybe unsure that what they experienced counts as sexual assault. They might be doubtful just as to how they would even go about proving what's happened to them, or perhaps just concerned that police officers won't take them seriously even if they do report it. Or potentially they're just entirely unaware that sexual assault or rape by deception is even a thing, right? Because there isn't really a lot about it in rape counselling guidance or sex education curricula. So I think that probably more sophisticated education across the board is going to be the crucial component when it comes to sort of attempting to minimize the risks of teledildonics-enabled sexual assault by deception. But of course, before any of that, we'll first need to agree that it truly is possible to be sexually assaulted or raped by someone not even in the same town, city, country as you via the medium of teledildonics at all, right? And I think we're still some way away from settling that question definitively yet.
Okay, well, that's all we've got time for. So, Robbie Arrell, thanks very much for being on the podcast.
Thanks for having me, Jim.
If you enjoyed this episode of Ethics Untangled, please like and subscribe and recommend us to your friends. The podcast is edited by Mark Smith at Leeds Media Services, and our music is by Kate Wood. Ethics Untangled is brought to you by the Idea Centre, a specialist unit for teaching, research, training and consultancy in applied ethics at the University of Leeds. We offer master's programmes in healthcare ethics and applied and professional ethics, and PhDs available full or part-time and face-to-face or by online learning. We also offer consultancy and training services for business and the professions, including help with the difficult ethical issues faced by your organisation, commissioned research projects, and online or face-to-face CPD. If you'd like to find out more about these or any of our other activities, please visit our website at ahc.leeds.ac.uk/ethics. /ethics.